Hello everyone, today we are going to learn Chapter 10, Measuring Exposure to Exchange Rate Fluctuation. The learning objectives include 1. Discuss the relevance of an MNC's exposure to exchange rate risk. 2. Explain how transaction exposure can be measured. 3. Explain how economic exposure can be measured. 4. Explain how translation exposure can be measured. The forms of exchange rate exposure include transaction exposure, economic exposure, and translation exposure. Transaction exposure is the sensitivity of the firm's contractual transactions in foreign currencies to exchange rate movement. Economic exposure is the sensitivity of the firm's cash flows to exchange rate movement, sometimes referred as operating exposure. Translation exposure is the exposure of the MNC's consolidated financial statement to exchange rate fluctuation. Now we come to the summary of this chapter. Exchange rate movements can affect a MNC's cash flow and therefore can affect its performance and value. MNCs with less risk can obtain funds at lower financing cost. Because they may experience more volatile cash flows due to exchange rate movement, exchange rate risk can also affect their financing cost. Thus, MNCs frequently attempt to measure their exposure to exchange rate risk, as explained in this chapter, so we can decide whether and how to hedge that risk, as explained in next two chapters. Transaction exposure is the exposure of an MNC's contractual transactions to exchange rate movement. MNCs can measure their transaction exposure by determining their future payables and receivables position in various currencies, along with the volatility levels and correlations of this currency. From this information, they can assess how their revenue and cost may change in response to various exchange rate scenarios. Economic exposure is any exposure of an economic's cash flows, direct cash flow or indirect, to exchange rate movements. MNCs can attempt to measure their economic exposure by determining the extent to which their cash flows will be affected by their exposure to each foreign currency. Translation exposure is the exposure of an MNC's consolidated financial statement to exchange rate movement. To measure translation exposure, MNCs can forecast their earnings in each foreign currency and then determine how their earnings could be affected by potential exchange rate movement of each currency. This one could be done by additional fund needed analysis.